Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going way back to medieval Europe. We're going to bust some myths wide open using some really cool historical texts.
Yeah, it's interesting. The romanticized version of knights and all that, we're going to see what life was actually like.
Right, like how did political systems work? What about everyday life for, different people?
It's kind of crazy how much our view of the Middle Ages is shaped by movies and all that. We're going to look at, how political and social systems actually function.
Okay, so first things first, what even were the Middle Ages? It feels like a massive chunk of time.
You're right. It wasn't like one event. Even historians, they debate the exact dates. It's more about those big shifts in power, and culture and just how people live their lives.
Right. It's not just like 1 year it started and 1 year it ended. Our source actually mentioned this guy, Flavio Biondo. Who was he?
Oh, he was like a 15th century history influencer, part of this group called Humanist Scholars.
Humanist Sol.
Yeah, basically they were really into the ancient Greeks and Romans. So they saw, everything after Rome as this kind of like in-between time.
Hence Middle Ages.
Exactly. Like a bridge to their time, the Renaissance.
So they were looking back and judging based on their own present.
Totally. It shows how, tricky it can be to define these periods. We always have our own baggage.
Yeah, for sure. You always bring your own perspective.
Oh.
Okay, so if we can't get a precise timeline, what are some key markers we can use to think about the Middle Ages?
Most historians agree the fall of the Western Roman Empire is a good starting point. That's 5th century. And the end, the late 15th century sees some massive shifts.
Like what?
Well, think about the printing press. The Americas being explored. Huge changes.
So we're talking about 1,000 years. No wonder it's hard to make, general statements about it.
And to make things even more complicated, Middle Ages was totally different depending on where you were.
Oh, right, of course.
Western Europe, they had some serious upheaval after Rome fell. But the Eastern Roman Empire, also called Byzantium, they were thriving.
Right. Totally different over there.
Plus the Islamic Golden Age. They had huge advances, in science, math, art.
That's a good point. It's like we can't just call a whole millennium the Dark Ages just because things were rough in one part of the world.
You've hit on it. The Dark Ages idea is a huge misconception.
Yeah.
People often, they picture this bleak time, all doom and gloom.
Yeah, thanks to movies, we just think of, knights and chivalry and castles.
The romanticized version. But our sources, they talk about famine, disease, social unrest. Not so romantic, huh?
Yeah, definitely not. Our source mentioned this guy, Rodulfus Glaber.
Oh, yeah, he was a chronicler. Describes a horrific famine in 1033. People, they were so desperate they started eating anything they could find.
Oh, wow.
It got pretty grim. The Middle Ages had good times, but, incredibly hard times, too. We have to embrace that complexity.
Yeah, to really understand it. So how do we even begin to understand something this complex? Where do we start?
Well, one way is to look at power, how it was structured. You've heard of the feudal system, right?
Yeah, feudalism. Makes me think of those dry definitions in textbooks.
Imagine, your whole life is decided by your birth. You might be a peasant tied to the land, working for a lord you've never even met.
So you're saying in the Middle Ages, I'm probably a peasant?
Possibly. But that was feudalism. At the top, you had the king, granting land to nobles in exchange for loyalty and military support. And those nobles, they had vassals who owed them allegiance. A very rigid hierarchy.
So basically you're stuck, no chance to move up.
It was limited, but not impossible. Cities started to grow, and this new middle class emerged. Merchants, artisans, they started gaining wealth and influence.
As trade expanded, right?
Yeah, trade routes expanded, cities became hubs of commerce. They operated outside that land-based system, and that challenged the old ways.
So they were like the entrepreneurs of their time.
Exactly. Not bound by the traditional rules. Our sources actually highlight this. Think about the massive building projects. Cathedrals, universities, they needed skilled workers, planning. And universities attracted scholars from everywhere.
So education and knowledge became more accessible?
It was a huge deal. It also, it changed the role of artists. Early medieval art, mostly religious. But then we see wider subjects like city life, portraits.
Reflecting the changes, right?
Exactly. Cities growing, people had more freedom. Art started reflecting that.
Makes sense. So was that part of a wider cultural evolution?
It was. In the early Middle Ages, most people had a very limited worldview. Travel was restricted, the church controlled information, and the focus was on the afterlife.
Kind of suffocating.
But even then, we see folk culture emerging. Traveling jugglers, musicians.
Entertainment.
Exactly. They entertained, spread news, even challenged authority through, satire and humor.
I love it. Our source mentioned satirical lyrics that made fun of like feudal lords and the clergy.
Right. A form of social commentary. Rebellion through art. Even in a rigid system, new ideas found a way.
Wow, this is really making me rethink the Middle Ages. It's so much more dynamic than I thought.
And we've only just started. We haven't even gotten to, the role of women or misconceptions about witchcraft or the changes that led to the end of the medieval period.
So before we were talking about how dynamic medieval Europe actually was, now let's get into, a topic that's, always misunderstood, the role of women.
Yeah, the Middle Ages had some, let's just say, interesting ideas about women.
That's putting it lightly. We've all seen the images of witches being burned, persecuted. How accurate is that really?
Well, not as accurate as you might think. There were, accusations and trials, but those big witch hunts, those happened later, like during the Renaissance, the early modern period.
So another case of history getting mixed up.
Totally. Popular narratives, they don't always match the facts. It's good to remember that.
Okay, so if witch burnings weren't as common, what was the view of women back then?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
Our sources, they paint a very mixed picture. Women were both feared and kind of put on a pedestal, seen as temptresses, but also objects of veneration.
It sounds like, totally different ideas kind of clashing.
Exactly. And those conflicting views, they pop up everywhere. Religious teachings, literature, art.
Oh, our source had some specific examples of this, right?
Yeah. Think about how the church emphasized chastity for, monks. But at the same time, women were glorified in art and literature. Take Dante's Beatrice, for instance.
Hold on, back up. Who's Beatrice? For those of us who haven't read the Divine Comedy recently.
Okay, so imagine this love. So powerful, it goes beyond earthly limits. It guides you on this spiritual journey. That's Beatrice in Dante's poem. She becomes a symbol of, pure love. Idealized love, which was, a common theme back then.
So on one hand, women are a temptation, but on the other, they represent, spiritual goodness.
Yeah, it's this paradox. It shows how, complex attitudes were towards women.
Right. And our source also mentioned the Canticorum, right?
The Song of Songs. Oh yeah, it's a really interesting book from the Bible. Celebrates romantic and physical love.
So not your typical, fire and brimstone
sermon. It was often interpreted allegorically. The bride represents the church, the groom represents Christ, but people also read it on a more literal level.
Yes.
Celebrating earthly love.
Desire.
Exactly, desire. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It challenged this idea that desire was, sinful.
So even within the church, there were different ways of thinking about women's roles and, sexuality.
Yeah, the church wasn't like this unchanging thing. There were debates, disagreements, perspectives changed.
Kind of like those satirical lyrics we talked about before. Always that pushback.
You got it. History's never static. Even within rigid systems, people challenge things. They push for change.
Okay, let's be real. It wasn't all, sunshine and roses for women. Our source does mention some darker stuff, like Gilles de Rais.
Oh, yeah. Gilles de Rais. He's a chilling example of the misogyny, the violence women faced. He was a French nobleman, a military leader, convicted of, horrific crimes.
Crimes against
children. It's a stark reminder that the Middle Ages could be brutal, unjust.
For sure. And is this where the Malleus Maleficarum comes in?
The what?
The Malleus Maleficarum.
Oh, yeah, the Hammer of Witches. It was this, basically a witch hunting manual, written in the late 15th century, laid out ways to identify, interrogate, and punish suspected witches.
So this wasn't just some theory, it actually, affected people.
Oh yeah, it had a huge impact, a really devastating impact. It fueled those witch hunts that happened, later during the Renaissance, led to the deaths of so many people, mostly women.
Wow, that's really chilling.
It's a reminder, right? The past has progress and darkness. We have to acknowledge both.
Yeah, to really get... So we've talked about feudalism, the growth of cities, cultural shifts, and, the complicated roles of women. What were some of the big developments that eventually led to the end of the medieval period?
That's where we start to see, the beginnings of the Renaissance, the early modern world. One of the most important events, that was the Protestant Reformation.
Ah, yes. Martin Luther, his 95 Theses.
Huge moment. Martin Luther, he was a German monk, challenged the authority of the Catholic Church.
Can you remind us what he was protesting?
He was against a lot of the church's practices.
Yeah.
Especially indulgences. Those were like pardons you could buy for your sins. Luther believed that, salvation came through faith in Jesus alone, not through good works or paying the church.
So basically, you can't buy your way into heaven.
Exactly. It was this direct challenge to the church's power. And it resonated with a lot of people who, were unhappy with the church.
Our source mentioned that this also impacted social and economic structures, especially in Germany.
Right, because the Reformation happened at the same time as, growing class struggles, the rise of, early capitalism. In Germany, feudalism was still strong, and Luther's ideas, they were really popular with peasants and urban workers.
Because they resented the nobles and the church.
Exactly. So the Reformation, it wasn't just about religion, it was social, economic too.
Our source mentioned a family, the Fuggers. Who were they?
Oh, the Fuggers. They were like rock stars of medieval finance. Super powerful merchant family from Germany. Made a fortune in trade, banking. They were so wealthy. I mean, they even lent money to kings and popes.
Wow. So they were basically at the top of this, this new economic order.
Yeah, they show how much the economic landscape was changing, the growth of cities, trade expanding, the rise of, a wealthy merchant class. All that led to the decline of feudalism and the rise of capitalism.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered about the Middle Ages. It wasn't just knights and castles, or even just doom and gloom.
It was so much more dynamic.
Yeah, like we talked about innovation, that those cultural shifts, and even how the modern world started to peek through.
Yeah, all those seemingly opposite things, they existed together. And, that's how history gets made.
Right. The Middle Ages weren't just waiting for the Renaissance to happen.
Exactly.
We've been on a whirlwind tour. Castles, cathedrals, even the Bible. It's like we've been, on an archaeological dig.
And like a good dig, we've probably ended up with more questions than answers.
Ooh, I like that. So hit us with it. What questions should our listeners be thinking about as they, explore the Middle Ages more on their own?
Well, now that we've seen what life was actually like, how does that change how we see, all those stories and images we have of the Middle Ages? Like, what other misconceptions are we carrying around?
It's easy to get caught up in the, the romanticized versions.
Yeah, the romanticized versions. But those versions, they're filtered through someone else's perspective.
Right. Someone else's. And those perspectives, they're shaped by all sorts of things. Politics, social norms, even just personal biases.
Exactly. So we have to be careful. Examine those narratives. Look for different points of view.
It makes you realize history is not just about, memorizing facts and dates.
It's about understanding, how did our world get to be this way?
Exactly. And the Middle Ages, all those complexities and contradictions, they actually laid the groundwork for so much of what we have today.
Things we just take for granted.
I think it's safe to say, we've only scratched the surface.
Only scratched the surface.
But hopefully our listeners, they have a new appreciation for the Middle Ages. And maybe they'll keep exploring.
There's a whole world of history out there, full of surprises. Who knows what you'll find?
I love it. That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Middle Ages. Until next time, keep those mental time machines running.
Wow. What an incredible journey through the politics, culture, and life of medieval Europe. From the rise of the feudal system to the Renaissance's dawn, it's amazing to see how these historical moments continue to shape our world today. But hey, we've only scratched the surface. What do you think was the most surprising part of medieval life? Was it the harsh realities of famine and disease, or the beauty and artistry that arose despite it all? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this deep dive into history. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. We've got a lot more fascinating content coming up that you won't want to miss, from the mysteries of ancient civilizations to the turning points of modern history. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next video.